the way that I envision this next portion of the program going is I'm going to start off with at least one question that I want to ask, and I'm hoping that maybe we can take maybe a few minutes to just have the speakers address it, and then I really, like I said earlier, want to open this up for you all. And if you haven't noticed in the back, we are filming this. It's going to be up on our member portal probably by the middle or so of the month. Don has promised he's going to get me the footage soon. But one of the things that we need to do is speak into microphones, so the video will pick it up, and when people are watching this, they'll be able to hear the question. So Annette in the back, wave Annette, has a microphone that she's going to be passing around, and I can pass this one around for you to ask your questions. Before we begin, three people that I want to point out as being the people that have helped make this happen. Annette and Robbie are two people who do all of the back end stuff. Daryl and I get up and speak and have fun, but Annette and Rob's been walking around. They are the people that make this happen. They are the people that are helping with the sign up, the registration, bringing stuff over here. So thank you to both of them, and then thank you to Daryl for letting me do this. having the faith in me to do this, so thank you for your support, and I guess we'll get started. So this is the question that Daryl asked me to ask.
Did it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess I didn't have to. So a quote from Shauna Devine, and her book is out front for sale, but she writes one of the essays in Robert's book. And she writes in the essay, "Indeed, for an ambitious, wealthy student in the long-settled eastern United States, there was not only a considerable educational opportunities in the medical field, but also a network of professionals devoted to helping each other succeed. And these social connections became increasingly important during the war years." So my question then is, I'm wondering if you can comment a bit on the social networks that form amongst these medical professionals, and how they work together or didn't work together in different ways.
Do you want to go first?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of Shauna's work is actually with hospital doctors. And I've really discovered there's a lot of difference between the experience of hospital doctors and regimental doctors. So the regimental doctors are kind of thrown together, not by choice. I mean, that is what happens. Sometimes they're with communities and people that they might know, but especially by Gettysburg, they've been moving people around, and you go where you're told. So there's a lot of mixing around in that sense. I think that what I see is a kind of camaraderie that is very strong. Not so much to where they went to medical school or their social backing, but there's a lot of regimental but mostly brigade and division stuff, because they're not really, I know I was talking to someone else who has done some stuff with officers, and she said, I never see where the surgeons are messing with the officers. They were pretty much pushed aside, so they were kind of pushed together. So I think there is a lot of camaraderie at the regimental level, but it's more from this kind of shared experience with the regiment and the brigade and that whole system. I get much more of that from there than talking about social echelons, etc. Now, on the Confederate side, they're all of the same, mostly of the same class, so there's a lot of family backgrounds and things like that. But I don't see that same thing. But, the regimental surgeons are not as much into the pecking order as the ones in the hospitals. So I think she's probably finding more of it in hospital work. That's my guess.
I absolutely agree with everything Barbara said, just to add a few more little nuances to the thing. Certainly where doctors discovered other doctors who've been in the same medical school, no surprise, there's some camaraderie there. But also, it's a mixed bag. Different regiments can have different cultures of management. There's, not in Fulton, but there's another account, which I quote in the Fulton book, by a physician who just can't seem to fit in with the officer cadre. They just don't seem to mesh. He doesn't find somebody of intellectual parity to talk the things that interest him. That's probably happened many times. In Fulton's case, he has to go to Harrisburg for assignment. These regimental surgeons are assigned. There can be all kinds of meddling in the hierarchy where a governor may appoint some surgeons, either regimental or above. They may come into the system through other means, may be resented because of how they got appointed. Fulton, in the diary, is reporting to a surgeon that he thinks very little of because that particular surgeon essentially wanted him to lie on the books, and he refused to do it, and kind of resented it ever since. And even though that physician was well qualified and experienced, he ends up getting booted out later on. So you can have this sort of discord. But Fulton was initially assigned to the 150th Pennsylvania, so he had that mix with those officers, many of whom are also new to the war game themselves. The number 2 guy in the 150th is right out of Harvard. He and is a lieutenant colonel. So they're both young, and that lieutenant colonel ends up getting the Medal of Honor here, by the way, just down the road at McPherson's farm, and has his arm amputated at one of the churches that Fulton has to commandeer. So Fulton supervises his recovery. And that man ends up returning to duty, by the way, with one arm. So he knows the officers in the 150th. Then he's transferred to the 143rd, but the 150th, 43rd, 149th are all brigaded together. So they move everywhere together. So he has wide latitude, and he does talk about working out mess relationships. But it's something you are left to your own devices to do. If you are a physician, you're new, you're in this regiment, you have to figure out how you're going to construct those social relationships with other officers. And if you're standoffish, it will take nothing at all for those line officers to simply let you go and be off to the side. Fulton apparently was willing to join in and enter in a common mess relationship and tent with other officers. So that cemented a bond that apparently went through the war. What is interesting, though, too, is what happens after the war. I found no evidence that Fulton connected with any of his fellow surgeons from that time. I don't know that he didn't. I just can't find any documentation of it. Fulton is active in medical societies after the war and is gets in the local news for trying to get a Civil War tour together, or let's raise money to buy the comprehensive medical and surgical history of the war for a medical society, or bring speakers in to talk about their war experience. But even that, I see no evidence that he brought in former comrades. So there are a lot of questions with this, but it's a question that you posed, that Daryl's posed, that's worth a lot more investigation.
I also get a sense from looking at diaries and letters and things, it was pretty lonely.
Yeah.
I think they felt pretty isolated. We were talking about that they had to report to all these different masters, and they're kind of odd person out with the line rank,
right.
And they're kind of odd person out with the enlisted men. So they're kind of in this in-between area, and I do think some of them find it difficult.
As a tangent to this, surgeons are meeting each other across the divide here, the Confederate Union divide, and they're running into people that they know. And one of my research project number 5638, I think, I've developed a file over the last few years looking at surgeons as they become active in these local and regional medical societies, inviting each other, North and South, during the great lost cause reconciliation moment, to speak to each other about their war experiences and how they talk about it. And the one common characteristic, whenever these have been recorded, and some of these speeches have been recorded, is whether you're a North guy walking into a Southern room or a Southern guy walking into a North room, conversation begins the same way. We all know this job. We all did the same thing. Let's separate some of the political issues and just talk what we had to deal with. And they begin talking as if they're talking shop at a medical convention.
I also want to, we talked a little bit about this at lunch, and I brought something up that neither Barbara nor Robert had seen before, but there's an article in the Boston Medical Journal that talks about a meeting of the Medical Society of, I think it's the 2nd Division of the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac. So there's a group of these surgeons that get together after the Battle of Gettysburg and have basically a little symposium or a roundtable about treatment that they gave. So I'm wondering if, because they were the odd men out of the do they are they coalescing together and having these closer relationships even beyond the regiment, out into the division? And
So there was something in the medical schools that were called quiz classes. Have you heard those?
No. Don't know about quiz classes.
So if you were when you were at medical school, you might take an extra anatomy class or something like that outside of the regular stuff. But there were also things called quiz classes, and I think it was to drill for all of that sort of stuff. And I think because so many of these men were sort of not long out of medical school, and a number of them had been teaching in medical schools, even as recent graduates. But there was, in a way, their camaraderie and socialization was really almost a continuation of a medical school format. And they do talk about reading. They do talk about books. They do talk about actually having classes. And I think a good brigade surgeon or a division surgeon was almost acting like a professor and teaching, and because they were trying to increase and bring people along.
And that was one of my follow-up questions was, is this an outgrowth of what they experience in medical school? So you're confirming what I suspected. The other thing that I wonder, and it gets back to Robert's point, a lot of these men who go to Jefferson Medical College, who go to University of Pennsylvania, then end up going both north and south. So you almost have like this West Point phenomenon where you have these men that end up on either sides going to the same school. So a lot of these men.
Some of them were in Paris together.
Okay, so it goes beyond the shores of the United States. Okay, so any questions from the audience as we move forward? We have one over here, and Annette's right behind you.
Yes. I had a question. In your research, have you ran into any references or much reference regarding the treatment of the term, what we call PTSD today?
There, in Philadelphia, there was a hospital that opened at the beginning of the war called Turner's Lane Hospital. During the course of the war, it expanded, and a couple physicians who were good friends of the Surgeon General Hammond had arranged to have special wards set up. And one of them was set up by a Dr. DaCosta. And he was interested in gathering cases together. And you have to remember, Philadelphia is the second largest hospital city in the north, so cases are coming up, and then they're being distributed to hospitals. So these doctors are arranging to have certain kinds of cases identified and sent to them. DaCosta was interested in looking at a phenomenon that he called soldier's heart. And this was essentially cardiac stress that he was looking at, PTSD. So combat fatigue, these labels all came later, of course. But the phenomenon certainly was happening. And so there you had a ward, and it's discussed in Shauna's book. There is some record of that work done. That's sort of pre-PTSD analysis. And it did inform later work when combat fatigue became recognized as found. By World War I, that's still cited research. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I haven't found a whole lot about it because I haven't really been looking so much at patient care. But it actually comes up with the doctors themselves. They also suffer from that. Yeah. And so, alcoholism, all kinds of things like that are also part of what they're dealing with as well.
There's no question that doctors could not help but deal with what we would call PTSD now. And part of the problem would be there may not be a physical symptom. You don't show up at sick call with a bleeding wound and get it fixed. That's easy, relatively speaking. But to have no visible marks. This was a challenge for some physicians. Dr. S. Ware Mitchell, who had another wing looking at nerve injuries, was castigated by fellow physicians because he was describing a phenomenon that everybody in here recognizes, and it's Mitchell with Civil War soldiers who identified it, phantom limb syndrome. doctors would challenge that, saying, how can you possibly attribute a pain to a non-existent limb? This does not make practical or logical sense. So he was challenged on that. And his first publication of that phenomenon was done in the form of a short story under a pseudonym, where he introduced that to the public. So he didn't want to stretch his neck too far on the medical professional chopping block to get that out there. So there was opposition to this. And of course, you had the phenomenon of malingering. You got a doctor in a regiment who has to see patients all the time. He's going to be challenged by men who want to get on lighter duty or excused from duty. They're going to fake illnesses. He's got to learn how to recognize that. He's got to learn enough about psychology of soldiering and understand why, after a few campaigns with some pretty vicious fighting, he gets an increase in this kind of thing. People want to go home for homesickness, nostalgia, which was a medical diagnosis. It's a disease, nostalgia. So all of this is wrapped into a common picture, but the doctors can piece out the psychology of this in a lot of cases. They're just not calling it what we're calling it now, and it's not being systematically investigated.
We still don't do a very good job of treating it, so what can we expect for them?
Yeah.
That's better. Okay. Given the prevalence of amputations, are there any signs that any kind of businesses or industry started to become available for what we would call prosthetics today?
Oh, yeah, big time.
And I think as doctors are performing these amputations, one of the guidelines in surgical handbooks is to do it with keeping in mind that the stump is well suited for a prosthetic. So even at the point where the limb is being removed, they're thinking about that.
Right. There's a lot of discussion about a good stump.
Yeah.
I did this and it was a good stump.
Right.
There's companies proliferated, and the government, of course, gave pensions and little bursaries to get prosthetic limbs, and it became a boom industry. There's a lot of literature on this. Just as a little footnote to that, just as kind of an interesting story, there was a German-American soldier by the name of Henry Kircher, served with a Missouri regiment. I've been watching this guy for another project that relates to our college collection because he's in it. This man was shot in Georgia. He was shot in the leg, fell down on the ground, tried to get up, was shot in the arm, fell down again, stretcher bearers picked him up. He shot a third time while they were carting him off. And he had an arm on one side amputated and a leg on the other side amputated. And lest you feel sorry for this guy, by the end of the year, he's using a photograph of himself in uniform, holding onto a chair to steady himself, running for circuit court clerk back in his home jurisdiction. And the incumbent says, I ain't running against that. You can have the job. He had a long life. And he was very complimentary about the surgeons who did this work. And there has been published a book of his correspondence with his family, translated from German. And it's very interesting because he talks about the amputations of both limbs, and different methods are being used, flat method, circular method, different methods for different limbs. And he actually negotiates with the doctors before they do the surgery about the kind of amputation he wants in anticipation of wearing a prosthetic limb on the leg, but not the arm. He decides he's already planning his future and things he's going to do. And that's the way he wants it. So he has negotiated the kind of surgery he actually got. And the way he recovered matched his particular interest in wearing a prosthetic limb on only one stump. I don't know how many other examples there are out there of that kind of negotiation, but I thought it was pretty fascinating.
You've talked about advances in the organization, Letterman and that sort of thing, and advances in prosthetics and amputations, and I guess you'd call it plastic surgery during the war. Can you name some other major advances that were made technically by the medical community during the war?
You want to go first?
I can't think of the specifics off the top of my head, but I know that Shauna's book talks about advances in neurology, and you
Gangrene.
talked about
Gangrene.
gangrene as a disease is almost totally eradicated, correct? From or
Lesson.
lessened.
Yeah.
And gangrene is the sloughing of skin, and it's discovered that putting a bromine solution into the wound will it's a caustic chemical, will clear it up. And I forget the specifics of the case, but I read somewhere that there was a soldier who's near death because of gangrene, and they use the bromine solution on him, and the next morning he's up asking for 2 helpings of breakfast. Another one of my favorite cases to talk about is I'm not going to remember his name, but the case is hermetic sealing, and Benjamin Howard is a assistant surgeon. And right before the Battle of Gettysburg, I think it's June 26th or June 28th, he writes a letter to the Army. Probably goes to Hammond, and he says, I have this new treatment for chest wounds. So wounds that are going to be deadly, he says, well, we can pack the wound with gauze, cover it with collodin, which is a substance used to develop photographs, and it's going to seal up the wound and allow the lung to reinflate. And there's a soldier, and now I remember his name, Alexander Ross, 140th New York. He's wounded on Little Round Top. And his regimental division surgeons take a look at him and basically say, you're a goner. Perform this surgery on him, and he lives for 10 days. He's actually a patient, shows up on the patient rolls of the Seminary Hospital. Eventually passes away, but it's another step in how to treat these wounds that before would have been a death sentence, and are up to the point of the time that they do the surgery are still thought to be a death sentence.
I think you could categorize developments during the Civil War in certain ways that continued to influence medicine. One is category that Peter's talking about with specific remedies to specific problems. The other order of magnitude is the system, and with the Letterman system. The previous director of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine was fond of telling people, if you want to see Civil War medicine, watch an ambulance go to an emergency treatment center, because the system did not pre-exist the Civil War. It was an invention of the Civil War. And that system continues to be cited by medical authorities today as sort of the foundation of how we do emergency medical care. But I mentioned Dr. De Silva with his PTSD ward. The next ward over, looking at nerve injuries, made a special study. Before the war, you had MDs that more or less followed a common academic regimen, and then they had to be basically through an apprentice system. But it's after the war that we start getting specialties, cardiologists, neurologists. There was enough data accumulated during the war, enough professional medical literature, that it propelled these divisions of medicine, these subdivisions of medicine.
And a lot of that specialty comes because of the development of hospitals.
Yeah.
And so one of the really interesting things that I found about my Gettysburg doctors is they didn't all go home and practice medicine in a small town. A lot of them really liked institutional medicine. They had really learned and had worked in hospitals and this sort of organization of medicine. So many of them end up in sanitariums, in prison hospitals, but they are much more in an institutional setting rather than as a solo practitioner, which I find kind of interesting. But I would say that the development of those specialties is made possible by the development of this much more robust hospital environment, which, a single practitioner is not going to be able to.
Yeah, the hospitals, to build on Barbara's point, these are cities within cities. The large hospitals in Philadelphia, to take one, Maurer General Hospital, it began with nothing. And West Philadelphia, or Satterley General Hospital, these were the two largest ones in Philadelphia, thousands of beds, both inside and outside the hospital, in tents. And these were to take Mauer as an example, the train terminus went right to the hospital. So first American War, where you have casualties evacuated to remote locations from the front within a very short period of time by train or by boat. So they're coming to Philadelphia both by boat, which lands at West Philadelphia Hospital, by train at Mauer General. They're immediately apportioned to wards. They're grouped by common problems. So this was, in a way, the French Napoleonic hospital system that all our physicians were going to look at before the war. Why did they go to Paris? Partly because they were grouping people with like problems in like locations. So you had a population to work with and evolve remedies.
And you have chains of custody that you can look at a single soldier and follow his case through, and this shows up in the medical and surgical history, but there's much more to that, so you can see what treatment is working, what's not working, and then of course sharing that information among the world.
Okay, she's on. Good. Yes, two-part question here. One, these men that became doctors and such, did you find in your research maybe roughly what percentage might be following a family trend of medical? Not necessarily before the war, but maybe after the war, maybe their children or such following on. And also you mentioned prescriptions at the time were written in Latin. About when did that change and it become, they're
Still
really,
do.
They're still using some of those abbreviations, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a very special thing. You want to go first on that?
So families, it's very common for multiple generations. And it's not always father to son. Sometimes it's uncle to nephew. But especially early on, because of the before, in the 18th century, it's mostly apprenticeship, probably up until about 1820, 1830.
A little longer than that.
Well, that it's almost primarily
right.
apprenticeship.
Yeah.
So having a doctor in the family makes it it's a family business. So, for example, one of the Confederate doctors that I've been following, who went to University of Pennsylvania, his father and uncle were his preceptors, and he was going back into the family business. I mean, so they were definitely, that's not uncommon. And it's interesting, for example, in the Confederacy, the Confederate doctors are almost exclusively planters' sons or sons of mercantile. They're all well-to-do. And so for the planters' sons, a lot of them will be the younger sons who aren't going to inherit the plantation. So they may have land holdings, but they're not the principal inheritor. So there are people in the family who are doctors for the same reasons. So there's a lot of family training and studying. Sometimes people, I've found younger brothers actually are having their older brother as a preceptor. So there is a kind of, you see very much family connections going on.
Unfortunately, my guy, James Fulton, didn't come from a medical family. Nobody else wanted to follow it. Has no descendants who are involved in medicine at all. So I don't know what happened there. But, yeah.
Not all, but I mean, it is some. Yeah.
But one beautiful example of that, this Dr. S. Ware Mitchell, the phantom limb guy. His son, John, grows up to be a doctor, and Mitchell himself is the son of a prominent Philadelphia doctor. Although his father told him, the young Silas Ware, when he was thinking of becoming a doctor, he said, "You got brains but no industry. Don't become a doctor. You can't do it." So, of course, he did it and became a real innovator. His son, John, grows up and comes of age in the 1890s as a physician. And as a tribute to his father, he, the son of S. Ware Mitchell, writes a treatise on injuries to nerves based on his father's Civil War work. So he's taking the data his father generated and enlarging it and writing a new treatise a generation later, and thereby advancing the work.
Did you find many comments from the physicians that you read about how they interfaced with nurses? Both the non-professional people like Sally Myers, who we know helped Fulton at St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church right here in Gettysburg, and then I'm also interested, what did they think about the nurses under Dorothy Dix, for instance?
Oh, boy.
How was that relationship?
You want to go first with that one?
Well, I would say that they don't talk about the nurses very much. Which would indicate that they were way down in the pecking order in terms of their interest. There are some that clearly had good and close working relationships with the nurses, but more after Gettysburg. I think that's actually there seems to be more even after that. On the other hand, the nurses' accounts are the best descriptions of the doctors.
Yeah.
Because they don't hold back. So, you get a much better view of who these people are. They talk about, and, they're really personalities, and so you'll get an assistant surgeon describes the surgeon, the nurse describes the surgeon, and a lot of times you get a pretty clear picture of what the personality. So some of these people are pretty highfalutin and, just like doctors now, they feel like they are super, very strong in their position. And the nurses, there was a lot of conflict because the nurses were really looking at the food and diets. I mean, to a large extent, they were doing the cooking and feeding, et cetera. And there was quite a bit of conflict between what was the proper diet and what should be given. So that was one. Interestingly, I mentioned about Mary Edward Walker, Dr. Walker, and she had been trained as an eclectic and also had gone to the Hygeia therapeutic. And so she was actually, one of the reasons she was got into a lot of difficulty with the doctors was she was one who argued against overdoing she felt that they were doing too many amputations and that some of these could have been healed without amputation. So there was often, different therapeutic ideas that people were bringing to that. So
It's worth remembering that if you said the word nurse to say a Union or Confederate doctor at the beginning of the war, to them that would have connoted a man too sick or disabled to fight but could work in menial jobs in a hospital setting. By the end of the war, it means a woman as a paraprofessional. And there's a real evolution here. But as Barbara points out, the real revealing comments are probably in the correspondence and memoirs of the nurses. The few doctors, male doctors, who take the time to write about this are usually pretty disparaging about it. And they will talk about these women come as busybodies, or the women come bringing their own social order. They're the elite women. They're the working women. The elite women expect special privileges. You get that kind of characterization.
more trouble than they're worth.
More trouble than they're worth.
They're
But
taking up another tent.
oh yeah, and they're
That
using up our
tents,
time and
yeah.
resources. Where the women are successful is where they've figured out how to work out a professional social relationship with the male doctors. A combination of showing that you could stand up to them, as well as you knew what you were doing, and you were actually willing to get into the mess and roll your sleeves up and deal with it. So some very successful relationships were created, and in some cases, the women in those successful relationships were performing more than special diets, and they may actually attend at a surgical moment. So there are comments like that that percolate here and there in the literature. Still probably a lot more to do on this. There's been substantial literature that's come out on this in recent years.
I'm just remembering that the one time I really heard a positive thing was, and I can't remember which doctor, I'd have to go look it up, but it was a doctor who expressed his discomfort in writing letters to families and was very glad that the nurses were, the volunteers of the nurse was doing that. So there was a real, that I'm okay that this is like way beyond what I'm I'm comfortable doing, and was very happy to turn that part of it over. So that was a point where he really acknowledged that this was something that the women that were volunteering were much better at than he was.
But let's remember, women started to get paid for this. It wasn't solely volunteer, so people could draw pay. And a woman in charge of the drugstore and, say, special diets, these are huge responsibilities. They are not minimal at all, especially when a special diet was a prescribed medicine for a soldier. And some of the larger hospitals took great pride in customizing diet for each patient, like Maurer General Hospital that I mentioned had special diet kitchens just for this purpose. So this was pretty serious work. There are some unusual cases. In the Confederacy, there's, and she has a written account that's very nice, Phoebe Yates Pember. But she was an elite woman with resources, and she created her own hospital. She paid for it. So her role there was a little different than you'd find somewhere else. And she was accorded status. And I think she was even commissioned a captain, wasn't she?
So that she could be in charge of that
So she could be in charge of it.
A little bit closer to home, we looked down at Christ Lutheran Church, and the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster show up there sometime around the 6th of July, and in their official history, they write that, well, first thing, they bring a lot of their own supplies because they don't want to be taking up supplies that need to be for the soldiers. But the author of this little pamphlet, who I think is Rosina Hubley, I think it's pretty much assumed that it's their president, says that they get there and the surgeons are looking down upon them. But after they get to work, cooking the diet and changing the sheets, fluffing the pillows, the surgeons see their worth. Whether this is her writing and trying to make herself and her organization out to look better is one thing, but I that's an important part of treatment is how well are the soldiers taken care of, just kind of their common needs of food and bedding.
There's part of that question we haven't answered yet, and that was about Dorothea Dix, mentioned specifically. Dorothea Dix is obviously one of the names of most important influential women of the Civil War, but she's a problem in a couple of respects. She comes up through a background of working with asylums, asylum reform. She's got this role. She has to do heavy politicking, but she just seemed to have a personality that just pissed people off. And not just the men in the hierarchy. There were a lot of women that decided to work around her and not even participate in her system, Cornelia Hancock being one of them. So because she had strict rules, she had a paramilitary regimen, she had standards of dress and appearance. Age particularly, if you were young, forget it. Too much hanky-panky suspected of going on in those hospitals. I always marvel at that sort of image of a Civil War hospital with a romantic tryst going on, considering the smell, if nothing else. I can't see what would bring two people together in the back room in one of those
I'm not going to
wards.
speculate.
No.
Any comment about the Sisters of Charity from Emmitsburg came up, and they were well respected by many. Did the surgeons appreciate them at least?
Yes, and you'll laugh at the reason why. I mean, they were hugely effective. Surgeons recognize that. But they're in a paramilitary order themselves. So surgeons complimented them because they took orders well. And they would do any task, however menial, they would do it. But the Sisters, much has been written. Barbara Mann Wall has been particular authority on the Sisters of Mercy. And they did incredible work, absolutely fantastic work. And it's good that they're getting their due in scholarship.
Like many soldiers, my husband's great-great-uncle died at Fort Pulaski in 1862 of dysentery. So I was wondering if there were any advances during the course of the war in either the prevention or treatment of that, which took so many lives.
Dysentery or diarrhea. No clear distinction between the two from the doctor's point of view, except one is just a worse and persistent case than the other. Certainly one of the criticisms that's brought to bear about Civil War medicine, they hadn't identified bacteria as disease-causing, hadn't identified viruses yet. I'm always reluctant to say that because it's too easy to criticize what they didn't know. rather than recognize what they did and did well. This was any physician who wrote a first-person account mentions diarrhea sooner or later. It's just a persistent problem. They had some chemical remedies, such as opium, for it, which actually could be effective. They did recognize certain practical treatments, like we would call electrolyte balances through depletion. They didn't maybe use that terminology, but they recognized that that remedy worked with replenishing the right fluids and good diet. So they had some good ideas about it, but they could never get free of the problem. I don't know. Do you want to say anything else about it?
I think that this sort of goes along with the whole sanitation thing too. So they were beginning to understand that there were relationships between good water and dysentery outbreaks, etc. Even bad food. I mean, some of it was food poisoning because they were carrying meat around in a rucksack. I mean, how good was that going to be after a few days in the sun? So, I mean, I think a combination, and the doctors were very aware of better food and sanitation. They weren't always, even when they were advocating for it, they weren't very successful always in making sure that the camp was being run that way because they didn't really have the clout to make things happen, and unless they had a regimental commander that was willing to go along with it, they sometimes weren't very successful. And the doctors themselves were, I mean, they end up in the hospital with dysentery, and many of them after the war are debilitated by ongoing issues with dysentery. So they were not immune to it either. They suffered right along.
The big pavilion-style hospitals, as they're called, that were sprung up during the Civil War and then immediately closed when the war ended, like I mentioned Maurer and Satterley Hospital in Philadelphia. Essentially, there's a woman responsible for this. I mean, Florence Nightingale was already a household name when the war broke out here. And, of course, her anchor to fame is the Crimean War. Much of her work she later repudiated herself for doing, as saying she caused a lot of deaths by not recognizing X, Y, and Z. So here she is at Scutari Hospital in Turkey with a cesspool underneath it and no drainage, no sanitation. And so the whole idea about sanitation control, cleanliness, huge windows, as these pavilion hospitals had to encourage ventilation, was a Florence Nightingale thing. So her ideas had already been published and were already in the consciousness of U.S. military doctors when the war broke out. So we had that model to begin with to help militate against those conditions. Yeah, when you read about these rations ordered, like they're going to give you a 3 days ration of meat, put in your haversack for the next 3 days while the Battle of Gettysburg is happening. I mean, come on. I'd like to do a chemical analysis of a surviving rucksack to see what actually is in there.
In the mid-18th century, understanding of medical processes, disease, and you guys have mentioned some of these terms, there was quite a variability of medical education. Can the panel comment on eclectic schools, homeopathy, allopathic, osteopathic? Wasn't there some biases towards different portions of medicine in taking physicians into the medical corps?
Yeah, one of the reasons the American Medical Association was created was to kick out the homeopaths and badmouth them, keep them out of the. You've been right on top of that.
This is your
I've
thing.
been looking at this. In the 1820s or so, there's really, you can almost think of it as another reform movement of the 19th century. So regular allopathic surgeons led by Rush, who was the arbiter of all, were about, bleeding and calomel. Those were the two main things, and then surgery, but not a lot early on. So there were a lot of people that felt that this was way overdone, that people were suffering. I mean, people were looking at debilitation from the medical treatment. So doctors didn't have weren't held in high regard. So there are these reforms of, pieces to reform medicine. So one of them is Thompson, in Thomsonian medicine, who's an American, and he comes up with this whole thing based on herbal treatments. He actually has the same system of thinking of inflammation and what's the other inflammation? Sthenic and
Yeah, I know.
but anyway,
Right,
so
yeah.
he's also using, instead of calomel, he's substituting lobelia, but it's still a cathartic. I mean, it's not all that different, but the idea was to get away from all of these mineral, heavy metals like mercury, etc., which were doing people no good. So you can think of them as quacks, which they were called, or you can think of them as people who were saying, let's look at a different way of treating these things. He was not a trained doctor, so this was much more of a kind of trial and error and using folk medicine and traditional medicine. It became very popular. A lot of people went with it and were, they didn't do, he did a patent and licensed people in his system. So it was a little bit on the edgy side. Homeopathy, on the other hand, comes out of Germany in the 18th century. He's actually in the 18th century. He is a trained physician and comes up with this system that like cures like, and if you diluted the chemical or substance that created a symptom in a dilute form, it would cure the symptom. And a lot of people were very attracted to it because he had come to his dosages by scientific method. So the scientists in the medical field couldn't completely dismiss him because he was a doctor, it was very scientific. But that doesn't really come to the United States until the 1840s, and a lot of it comes, real interest in homeopathy expands when there's a lot of German immigrants that come in the 1840s. So that's really in the 1840s. But they actually, like in the cholera epidemics, people notice that people survive cholera in greater numbers being treated by homeopaths than they do the regular doctors when they're being bled and fed calomel. So there is a lot of competition for that. And then there's also hydropathy, which goes into the 20th century as Turkish baths and all kinds of, taking the cures and water and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a lot of other suggestions, and I think it's interesting because I think Shauna Devine says that the Civil War changes the public attitude toward allopaths. Well, I think the Civil War changed allopaths because when you think of someone like Hammond now getting rid of calomel and bloodletting, allopathy was changing. So in some ways, the reform movements did have some effect, and that they all then move into a new direction with Lister and germ theory, etc. The eclectics are kind of interesting because they were trained in all other aspects of medicine. They were surgical, all that stuff, anatomy, completely trained as physicians. But rather than bloodletting and the heroic methods of bloodletting and calomel, they leaned more toward botanical and herbal treatments. And they were eclectic in that they were looking, whatever worked, they were willing to encompass. So they kind of get a bad rap because at the end of after the Civil War, some of the eclectic medical colleges become diploma mills. But the eclectic colleges at the mid-century were turning out perfectly well trained doctors.
With these different philosophies, it creates a real dilemma for the public. What do you choose? And particularly for lawmakers. And so Barbara mentioned cholera. There was a huge cholera outbreak in New York, one in Philadelphia in the 1830s. And at this time, allopaths are trying to get license laws passed. There generally are no licensing requirements for physicians. One reason there are these competing schools. And for most of the 19th century, allopathic physicians and homeopathic physicians were like 50-50. You really had two monumental choices here. But after cholera outbreak, and it was clear that the allopaths were not making this any better, states that had started to pass laws favoring allopaths for regulation and licensing started to rescind those laws and say, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't the best game in town. Maybe we should keep this open to other philosophies. And so the United States was relatively slow to get on the licensing game because of all of this.
Yeah, which is interesting because by the time of the Civil War, really a medical degree is really the only credential.
I saw a little filler in an early allopathic medical journal that was designed to be a joke. A doctor said he had been visiting colleagues in Germany, I think it was, and he purchased a wonderful sausage to bring back and give to a fellow doctor. But on the long trip back, he thought, that's looking really good. I'll take a piece. I'll take another piece. I'll take another piece. And by the time he got back to give it to the recipient, he only had this much left. So he presented to the colleague and said, I've just become a homeopathic doctor. Here's you can infer the rest of the sausage from the tiny bit. But, lest we laugh at homeopaths, one area in the Civil War where they absolutely converged was on smallpox vaccination. What do you put in the vaccine? It's a piece of the virus from an active suffering person, and you're hoping to stave off the onset of the disease by doing the same thing. That doctor I mentioned earlier, that Fulton worked for a short time with a fellow doctor whose diary survives at the Smithsonian. And when I went to see the Smithsonian, I found out this guy was playing both sides. He had allopathic medicines, homeopathic medicines, which the Smithsonian has, and he kept a pocket diary, but in a homeopathic notebook. And the one area of the book that he filled in for his regiment was, it had a vaccination schedule. So he filled it in with the soldiers. So he filled it in as homeopathic notes. He didn't report that, to his superiors, but he was playing both sides.
How much did the shortage of medicine due to the Union blockade affect the Confederate surgeons' ability to treat their patients? And is it true that Richmond was handing out poppy seeds to civilians to try and supplement their morphine and opium?
Oh, in the
levels?
South, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was getting into the Porsche territory. The South did not have the manufacturing facilities that the North did. Philadelphia had the biggest, from the ground up, quinine production facility, not only to produce it, but to regularize it to a common purity that you couldn't rely on. Because both armies used this medical purveyor system where you'd have a medical professional who'd go out on the open market and buy stuff. And the South obviously was very limited and became more limited over time. The big story there is this guy Porsche, the physician who was assigned to figure out these other remedies. And so they surveyed in a very short period of time, making it a family thing. His wife and cousins and everybody else got into it. Survey every southern plant and determine what it could do medicinally and publish it. And you can still get that. It's no longer covered with its Confederate imprimatur, but it became field guide to southern this and that. And you can still find copies of this over generations. There's a little bit more Confederate ideology in the early one that's not there anymore. But the strange thing is, a lot of the plants, trees, shrubs that are identified are still big question marks, pharmacologically speaking. Nobody's done the work. And we keep getting these occasional surprise science tidbits in the news, like, guess what ancient remedy turned out to be effective? I suspect we got more of that coming. I don't recall, poppy seeds actually being distributed, but they were looking for all kinds of alternatives for morphine.
You could tincture poppy seeds and you'd get opium.
Yeah, maybe pretty mild, but who knows? Yeah. Well, that's laudanum, with alcohol.
So as we reach kind of near the end of our time, I'm gonna take over and ask the big question here is, where do we go next? I know Robert was looking forward to this question. Yeah, what are the next steps in the study of 19th century medicine, Civil War era more specifically?
Well,
does Barbara have notes?
You're one of the future, Barbara. What do you want to say on that point?
Well, I think we have to dig deeper and go beyond the official. You talk about the memoirs are cleaned up. the official histories are cleaned up, and I think if we really want to see more of accuracy of what was actually happening and the sort of the process of it, we need to get a little bit beyond just the things, the official story. And then also think about what changes over the 4 years. I think that's a really interesting thing. There's, we're just talking about Meyer. Catherine Meyer, talking about the campaigns in 1862, which is not exactly the same as what's happening in 1863 because there are changes. They do get better organized. The way ambulances work, the way they're treating measles and they're now getting separate hospitals for them and things like that. So I think to really be breaking it down and looking at what happens over the course of the Civil War, not just thinking about the Civil War medicine as a singular thing. And I think there's interesting things to do more from the regimental side with, we've looked at the hospitals, how they're organized, but really looking more about how the medical corps was organized in the field and what were those relationships. I don't think we know as much as we could about
I don't think that there's much, anything that really I can think of that's written on secondary sources on what I like to call medical logistics, which is that movement of men and material to and from the battlefields. And as we've talked about all day, there's huge changes.
I have to share a very good insight, which is, as you know, if you've looked at it, that most of the Union Army Corps did not have their medical supplies with them because Meade said that they should stay back behind the lines, with one exception, which was the 12th Corps. The medical director of the 12th Corps was regular Army. It's a question whether he didn't get the memo or just decided not to follow the memo, but the 12th Corps had all of their medical supplies. Well, I found his last will and testimony, which gave me some insight into his personality. He has it all described exactly what is to happen when he dies, that his body is to be left. He has a fear of being buried alive. This is how he's to be carried, on a caisson or a plain wagon, that the minister is to be paid a certain amount from this denomination, et cetera, et cetera. This was definitely a guy who liked to be in control. So it is absolutely in keeping with his personality that, in fact, he brought his own medical things with him. But it's those kind of insights that give you a glimpse into who these people are. And they're not just a name. They really are a person that's making decisions based on a lot of different things.
I think no one has thought of doing what Barbara's doing and compiling this universe of 1,000 doctors who are all at the same moment, and how that works, and what we can infer from all this. And I think there can be a huge number of other threads that lead from this to other things when you get that work more out and published and people respond to it. But I think on the one hand, we need to ask new questions, searching questions, particularly about relationships, organization. We can start doing that with the data we've got. And Barbara has had, of course, to go beyond that, because you can't absolutely trust even official records, to get all the other bits and pieces and fragments, and it's Dead Sea Scrolls. You're assembling all of this to get the larger picture. And that work's going to go on. I want to put a plug in for the science part. I mentioned the testing of kits for smallpox. And we've worked up a protocol with our science friends at McMaster University. We've got a non-destructive testing protocol, which is good for instruments. Now, a lot of medical instruments, as you know, they can't be sterilized until the advent of antisepsis, when they started making them so they can be sterilized, which means collections don't sterilize them or clean them, and they can have all kinds of stuff on them. And hence, we've got these kits with residue from people who had smallpox and got vaccinated. So there's that. about a year and a half ago, I think it was, you may recall in the news the discovery of some sort of a shallow grave at Manassas. 2 soldiers and then some severed limbs with them. And I spoke to a medical historian at a conference, and I said, that's kind of exciting. You know, what we can do with that. He says, this just confirms what we already know. And I said, that's it? Well, I happened to talk to one of the leading anthropologists, forensic anthropologists in the country, who's working on that stuff. And there's a huge number of scientific questions attached to it. Not only looking at the health of the soldiers themselves who are in the ground and now exposed, what can we learn from them, but also what is visible on the human remains that tells us about the surgery, the surgical techniques, how things were done. There's always a mismatch between what people say they're doing and what they actually did. And this is one of the few ways we can get at that. And there'll be future opportunities as things like this get discovered again. But I was disappointed to hear a medical historian of repute just dismiss that out of hand as contributing any knowledge.
Jake Wynn from the National Museum of Health and Medicine was talking about that in a recent presentation about the limb pit, and how I think they did some sort of X-ray on the limbs, and you could see the actual the saw strokes through the limb. So that alone, thinking about practice and technology and tools.
It's even more than that in that case, because they've got, at least on some of the bones, shifting saw marks where the surgeon started to work here, changed his mind, changed over here, and then finally settled over here. Why was he making those decisions? What obstacles presented themselves?
Okay. Oh, wow. They can identify the surgeon who worked on this. Yeah. Well, we are at our appointed hour, so I want to thank everybody again for coming out today.
Thank you.